A fierce soccer match is in full swing on the field, but suddenly a strange purple light appears right in the middle of the field. The game is instantly interrupted, and both players and spectators freeze in shock. Then, something even more unbelievable happens. A group of heavily armed soldiers steps out of the purple light. The female leader at the front slowly speaks.
We are you, 30 years in the future.
That single sentence sends chills down everyone's spine. She explains that in the future, humanity is at war with creatures known as white spikes. In just 3 years, the global population has plummeted to fewer than 500,000. To prevent this, scientists developed a time travel device and returned 30 years to seek help before the disaster occurs. After this happened, people all over the world fell into panic. In just 12 months, jump devices started being deployed worldwide. Countries joined forces and sent troops to the future to fight the white spikes. But 7 days later, when the troops returned, people realized the survival rate was only 20%. That's because globally only half of the soldiers met the requirements for time travel. So world leaders reached an agreement and began drafting civilians into the fight. One day, Dan was teaching in a classroom when he received the third wave draft notice. He didn't think twice and showed up at the recruitment center the very next day. He was told to take off his shirt, then strapped into a chair. At that moment, Dan still didn't sense anything was wrong. Following the instructions, he put his arm into a machine beside him. Moments later, his information appeared on a screen, showing that he would die in 7 years. That meant he qualified for the draft. Right then, Dan realizes something isn't right, but it's already too late. The time jump device has been attached to his arm. The staff in front of him starts laying down the rules. The device on his arm can only be removed after he completes his service. If he tries to dodge it, a qualified family member will be sent in his place. And every device comes with a tracker. After getting home, Dan tells his wife everything. She knows how dangerous this is, but Dan also knows that if he doesn't go, his wife and daughter could end up facing the same fate. After saying goodbye to them, he heads to the training camp. There, the commander tells everyone they'll go through 7 days of basic training. But on the very first night, alarms suddenly go off. They're told they have to deploy to the future immediately. In no time, everyone gathers around the time jump device. As the purple light flares up again, recruits are sent into the wormhole one after another. Dan looks around nervously, but just as he's about to be pulled in, the staff suddenly realizes something's wrong. They messed up the drop coordinates. They were supposed to land on a beach, but instead, they're sent hundreds of meters up in the air over a city. Before they can even start fighting, a huge number of recruits are killed during the fall. Luckily, Dan crashes into a rooftop pool. He fights his way to the surface and even manages to pull his teammate Charlie out with him. After making it out, Dan and the others move to the edge of the building. What they see leaves him stunned. The entire city has been reduced to ruins. Not far away, the white spikes are viciously tearing apart the remaining survivors. At that moment, a voice from the future commander comes through Dan's earpiece. Since Dan is a former soldier, the commander appoints him as the temporary leader of the survivors. Then, he orders Dan to lead the recruits to a lab marked on the map. The city has already been overrun by white spikes, and the scientists trapped in the lab have lost contact. Once they rescue the research team, Command plans to send in bombers to wipe out the entire city, along with the white spikes. After receiving the mission, Dan quickly gathers the recruits and moves out toward the lab. Luckily, they don't run into any white spikes along the way. The streets are filled with horrifying scenes, and everyone stays on high alert. Fortunately, they make it to the lab building, but they're too late. The entire research team has already been slaughtered by the white spikes. Dan reports this back to the commander. After a brief silence, the commander issues a new order. They must locate the lab's materials and extract all biological samples and research data. Just as everyone finishes the mission and gets ready to leave, the commander spots something on the map, a massive swarm of white spikes rushing toward the lab. As soon as the evacuation order comes in, Dan leads the team down the stairs. But things go sideways fast. Strange noises echo from above. A white spike is already there, staring them down. The fight breaks out instantly and everyone opens fire. But these creatures are covered in tough armor, and their tails can launch sharp spikes. The team is completely overwhelmed, barely able to fight back. They're forced back into the hallway. With the white spike closing in, Dan smashes a nearby glass panel. He grabs an axe and, just as the creature lunges, brings it down hard on its head. But the monster is incredibly strong. At a critical moment, Dorian, a teammate who's seen combat before, steps up. He tells Dan the creature's weak spots are its belly and head, and tells everyone to move. At that moment, the white spikes chasing them suddenly let out a piercing roar. In an instant, all the creatures start rushing in the same direction.
We can't afford to lose them. Romeo, actually, the bombing's gonna
The fleeing team spots a rescue vehicle ahead and finally breathes a sigh of relief. But the next second, a monster appears out of nowhere. Within seconds, the soldiers inside the vehicle are devoured. At the same time, the bombing countdown is about to hit 0. With the white spikes closing in behind them, the team can only run while fighting back. Then suddenly, one of Dan's teammates missteps and falls. Dan refuses to leave him behind and jumps down, despite others trying to stop him. But the injured teammate doesn't want to slow them down. He tells Dan to go and chooses to take the incoming monsters down with him. Explosions go off one after another, filling the air with smoke. A helicopter appears overhead, and Dan, along with the others, disappears into the smoke. When Dan wakes up again, only Charlie, Dorian, and him are left. Dorian blames Dan for risking the whole team over one person, but Dan doesn't see it that way. He can't stand the thought of anyone with a chance to survive being left to die. As the two argue, a soldier approaches and tells Dan the commander wants to see him. But what Dan doesn't expect is that the commander standing before him is actually his daughter from 30 years in the future, Romeo. Dan tries to hug her, but she turns him down. There's no time to catch up. She tells him they are about to carry out an extremely dangerous mission. From their conversation, Dan learns that the serum they recovered can only kill male white spikes. To truly eliminate the threat, they have to capture a female alive for research. Without hesitation, Dan immediately boards a helicopter with his daughter and heads to the white spike nest. Upon arrival, the soldiers launch a rapid assault, trapping the female inside the cave. But no matter how much sedative they inject, it has no effect. They try to drag it into a cage with ropes, but the creature suddenly goes berserk and bursts out of the cave. Seeing the situation spiral out of control, Command decides to enter the cave herself. She immediately takes aim at the creature's tentacles, forcing it to retreat. Just then, from the helicopter, Dan hears the distant roars of a massive number of creatures in the forest. The female white spike has sent out a distress signal, and all the males begin swarming toward the nest. Hearing over the radio that his daughter is hurt, Dan immediately grabs a rifle and slides down from the helicopter on a rope. He quickly takes out the white spikes charging at him, then rushes into the cave. He grabs the creature's tentacle and drives a blade deep into its body. The intense pain instantly weakens it. Seizing the moment, Command orders the soldiers to lure it into the cage. The helicopter lifts the cage out of the cave, but the white spikes are already closing in. A massive group of male white spikes swarm toward the female. Luckily, another helicopter provides heavy fire support and holds them off for a moment. In the chaos, Dan and Command jump onto an armored vehicle. Dan drives to break through, while Romeo lays down suppressive fire with her rifle from the back. Soon they manage to escape the encirclement. After that, they're transported to humanity's last stronghold, the offshore Fortress 9. After a night of rest, Dan heads to his daughter's lab. Because the female white spike can neutralize toxins, Command has to inject her with sedatives every hour to keep her unconscious, making it possible to extract the serum. After countless trials, they finally develop a compound that can kill the female. But they don't realize the creature behind them is slowly waking up. The next second, a deafening roar echoes through the base, and alarms start blaring everywhere. As chaos erupts outside, Romeo realizes what's coming and places their last hope on Dan. If they can survive the final 8 minutes before the jump, the serum can be sent back to the past and mass-produced. But just as they leave the lab, white spikes break in and rescue the female. In the next instant, she lets out a furious roar, and every male white spike locks onto Dan and Command as their targets. Meanwhile, Dan has to make it onto the helicopter to complete the time jump mid-air. But at this point, he and his daughter are completely surrounded by white spikes. With just a glance, they move in sync, opening fire and quickly clearing the creatures on both sides. Just as they're about to make a run for the rooftop helicopter, Command is suddenly impaled by a spike from a white spike behind her. With the number of creatures surging, the helicopter is forced to lift off early. Dan has no choice but to pull back with his injured daughter. But the entire base is already collapsing, explosions going off one after another. Dan looks at his wounded daughter, heartbroken, as the female white spike catches up. The deck gives way in a massive explosion, and Romeo falls right in front of, straight into the jaws of the creature. Dan reaches out to grab her, but in the next second, he's forcibly pulled back to the past. After waking up, Dan plans to hand the serum over to the military, but to his shock, they tell him the time jump device has just been destroyed. That means the serum can no longer be sent to the future. Back home, Dan becomes withdrawn and depressed. His wife notices the change and gently tries to comfort him. So, Dan tells her everything he experienced in the future. During their conversation, something she says suddenly clicks for him. The time the white spikes appeared isn't actually when they first arrived on Earth. If they can find when they truly landed, they could wipe them out before everything begins. That idea sparks a new plan. Dan tracks down Dorian, hoping to find clues from one of the first white spike claws he kept. Luckily, tests reveal traces of volcanic ash from the Changbai mountain region. But what confuses them is that the first outbreak happened in Russia. To dig deeper, they return to the school, and with help from a student obsessed with volcano research, they come to a conclusion: the white spikes were likely frozen beneath the ice in Russia. In the future timeline, it's global warming that eventually causes them to awaken. After pinpointing where they might have first appeared, Dan immediately goes to the US government for help. But they refuse to approve a mission to Russia. With no other option, Dan turns to his estranged father, Slade, a former pilot. Despite the tension between them since his mother's death, Dan chooses to work with him for his daughter's sake. Once Dan comes clean, his father quickly agrees to help. Then Dan reaches out to the commander from the training camp, who supplies them with plenty of the serum. Soon after, the team flies to the Russian glaciers by helicopter. Using snow vehicles they prepared in advance, they begin searching the frozen wasteland for any trace of the white spikes. After a long search, they finally detect an area with unusual magnetic activity. After setting charges, they blast it open, revealing a massive ice crater. At the bottom, they discover an ancient cave and move in to investigate. Moments later, Dan comes face to face with a massive alien ship frozen in the ice. They cut their way inside, but what they find is unexpected. The ship doesn't belong to the white spikes, but to alien beings that have long since frozen into dried corpses. The team realizes these creatures were likely just weapons used by the aliens to invade Earth. Ironically, the aliens themselves died here first. Seeing the fully developed white spikes, they immediately start injecting toxin into the embryos. But the intense pain causes the creatures to break out of their pods. Their screeches instantly wake the others in the same chamber. The team sped up the injection, but the two white long spikes still managed to escape. At the entrance, Slade and Charlie open fire right away. But Charlie isn't very skilled with a gun, and the creature gets dangerously close to Slade. At the critical moment, Charlie charges in with a cutting tool. The creature is sliced in half, but one manages to slip away. However, there are still many unhatched white spikes inside the ship. To stop the disaster from spreading, the remaining teammates choose to detonate their explosives and take the creatures down with them. In the end, only Dan makes it out alive. Just after reuniting with his father, Dan learns that one female white spike has already escaped from the cave. To prevent the nightmare from happening again, the two immediately begin searching across the glacier. Soon, the two split up and track the white spike by following its footprints. But unexpectedly, the creature spots Slade first. Just as it's about to lunge and tear him apart, it steps right into a trap they set earlier.
Surprise, dumbass.
At the critical moment, Dan arrives just in time. Working together, they force the white spike off a cliff. But Dan quickly realizes it's not over yet. The two immediately stand back to back, scanning their surroundings. Sure enough, the creature reappears the next second. It strikes fast and hard, its spike slamming straight into Dan's thigh. As it lunges again, Dan grits his teeth, yanks the spike out, and drives it back into the creature. Then Slade thrusts an ice axe into the white spike's eye. Blinded, the monster starts firing spikes wildly in every direction. Seizing the chance, Dan injects the serum directly into one of its tentacles. Just when they think it's finally over, the white spike suddenly rips off its poisoned tentacle. With the last dose of serum in his hand, Dan is ready to go all in, prepared to take the creature down with him by jumping off the cliff together. But right then, his father suddenly cuts his own hand. The smell of blood instantly grabs the creature's attention. It immediately switches targets and charges towards Slade. In that split second, Dan lunges forward and drives the serum deep into the white spike's body. Instantly, the creature begins to dissolve. Its entire body melts into a pool of blood and crashes down into the cliff behind them. In the end, the alien invasion that was supposed to happen in the future is completely stopped. Dan returns home and immediately pulls his daughter into a tight hug. Tears stream down his wife's face, but in that moment, it's more about relief and happiness than anything else. Then his father slowly steps out of the car and walks over. Romeo then gently stepped forward and embraced her grandfather. At last, the family stands together again. What lies ahead is a brand new future. Maybe the world is still full of uncertainty and challenges, but at least for now, they've found each other again and rediscovered what home truly means.